No mai anō. The government is being accused of being reckless by failing to listen to its own advisers about the economic costs of halting new oil and gas exploration permits. The National Party says the decision to go ahead, despite the advice, is appalling. And legislation is being introduced by the government to give effect to this policy. Let's talk about it more now with the Minister for Energy and Resources, Megan Woods. Good morning to you, Minister.
Good morning, Guyon.
Do you have confidence in your officials?
Yes, I do. I don't agree with some of the analysis, but I think what we've seen in terms of the report that goes along with the legislation that has been introduced is a very large range of what the economic impact could be. It ranges from 1.2 billion through to 23.5 billion. And when you've got a range that big, what it says is that it's really impossible to know. And that's exactly what the scientists who undertook the science that sits behind this economic modelling said. They said that it was almost impossible to quantify that which is unquantifiable.
So why did you go ahead then if you can't quantify what the risks to New Zealand are?
Because there are other risks, and they are economic risks that we have to take into account, Guyon, that we know that over the 40, 50-year horizon in which this policy will come into effect, because remember, this is a very long-term transition. We are keeping and honouring all the existing exploration permits that will see drilling potentially into the 2060s. But what we have to be doing is planning for those communities that rely on fossil fuels as their source of revenue and jobs. We're not a government that's prepared to cross our fingers and hope for the best. We know we need to start that long-term transition planning now, and that is exactly what we're doing.
You talk about the range, but that's why you have midpoints, and the advice specifically says a midpoint estimate of $7.9 billion.
That is true, but I think we have to go back to what the scientists who did the science that sits behind this said, which, it's talking about trying to quantify that which is almost unquantifiable. One of the things that we also have to bear in mind when we're looking at that $7.9 billion is since 1970, when we started measuring the royalties from this industry. So in that nearly 50 years, there's been $4.1 billion worth of royalties, and that includes Maui. And we've got no guarantees that we're going to strike another Maui. So what the report tells us is what we said at the time when we announced the policy is that there is no certainty in this, because remember, we are also honouring the 100,000 square kilometres of exploration permits that sit out there.
Okay.
We have a huge amount of acreage that will and can be drilled in the future.
The documents say that this may result in a decrease in the security and affordability of supply of gas and possibly electricity as gas resources become more scarce. Do you accept that?
No, look, I think that one of the things that document also says is that the model hasn't been able to take into account either technological changes or changes that other countries are going to make over a very long time period.
We started the interview, and I deliberately started it in this place. You said to me that you had confidence in your officials. These are people who are doing a professional job and giving the analysis to the best of their ability. And yet when they say something that conflicts with your political position, you're saying, oh no, it's not true. It's not true that supply will be affected. It's not true that it's going to cost us $8 billion.
No, what I'm doing, Guyon, is pointing to another part of their document where they say they haven't been able to take into account technological change or change that other countries are going to make. If we think back 10 years ago, and then we fast forward ourselves even 10 years over, and we've got a 40-year horizon around this, that technology is changing all the time.
Well, I take you to page 7 of their analysis. In terms of energy security, there is a relatively high certainty about the accuracy of the information. Direct quote. So they are pretty certain that this is going to have that impact, aren't they?
Look, what we've also seen is that Genesis Energy has come out and said that they're certain of supply of gas through to the 2030s, that we've seen the market making a whole lot of decisions since we made our announcement in April.
Will you be hauling in someone
ahead
from the bureaucracy and saying, hey, look, why have you got this so terribly wrong?
Oh, look, we've had conversations. Look, I mean, this is advice, not instruction. I think that people want to know that their minister is going to ask questions around advice that they receive. This isn't the first time that a government has disagreed with advice. You look back to what officials said about Kiwibank, that was going to be not something that's
going
positive.
massively off on a tangent.
It speaks to the point that advice is offered and governments don't always agree with everything that's in there.
Will this policy reduce our greenhouse gas emissions?
Yes, and it will also lead to a lowering of global greenhouse gas emissions.
Again, that is not what the advice says. It says that the changes may result in a decrease. It says that there's a risk that the change will result in uncertainty among petroleum explorers, but also that it could result in an increase in global greenhouse gas emissions.
Look, one of the things is things are moving so fast in this space that what you have to look at is that China's often held up as the country where production will move and it will be done with dirty coal, is what the industry often say. But when you actually look closely at what China is doing, it's introducing a more rigorous ETS than our own. It's a cap and trade system, so there has to be substitution. If, for example, the example that Mr Medchwick used of Methanex moving production to China and using coal to do it, then it has to be a substitution because the Chinese are capping their emissions, and all the evidence is pointing to the fact the Chinese have peaked their emissions ahead of their Paris targets. I was in China last week. The speed at which that economy is decarbonising and looking to renewables is phenomenal.
Just while you're here, and you know that you've taken over some of the responsibilities from Claire Curran, you will have seen the release of the emails and text messages from Derek Handley this morning. What is your response to his quite sharp criticism of, well, you and other ministers saying that he has not even to this day had any explanation as to why he was offered and then unoffered the role of CTO?
Look, officials have been in constant contact with Mr Handley. We made a conscious decision when there was a reallocation of the portfolios between Minister Hipkins as the State Services Minister and myself as the Minister that the CTO would be reporting to, that we were going to have officials deal with Mr Handley, that this was an employment matter and that that's what we were going to do.
Yeah, but it wasn't that way before, was it? I've seen 3 or 4 text messages from the Prime Minister back to him. There were lots of texts between the Minister, Claire Curran, and Derek Handley, and now suddenly looks like you don't want to know him.
No, look, let's be really clear. And Mr Handley's own released timeline makes it very clear that the Prime Minister did not have communications with him about the role of CTO. He acknowledges that they were not replied to.
Well, they were, though, weren't they, according to his timeline, because he says a number of people have urged me to seriously consider this CTO thing. He then sends a text message saying, what is the best email to send you a note with some starter thoughts? And she responds to that text message. It's been blacked out, but I presume, and it could only be, I guess, her personal email address.
Are you referring to the Prime Minister or Minister Curran?
Yeah.
Look, Mr Handley in his time makes clear that the text that he sent that referred to the CTO position in the email were not responded to by the Prime Minister.
There is a response from the Prime Minister, though.
But not in regard to the CTO role. And Mr Handley has made that really clear in what he's released.
Well, he does say, and I quote it for you again, a number of people have urged me to seriously consider this CTO thing.
But what Mr Handley also makes clear is the Prime Minister did not respond to the messages that he sent either by text or email that role.
She responded by text, giving him her personal email address, to which he then sends an email about the role.
The Prime Minister has been completely clear that there had been communications with Mr Handley, that she'd known him for a number of years, but she has also been clear, and what Mr Handley has released is they were not in regard to the CTO role.
Did you discuss the CTO role with the Prime Minister?
When the Prime Minister asked me to take on the portfolio, of course she pointed to the fact that the CTO would be reporting to me as the Minister responsible for government digital services.
And do you think he's been treated fairly? I mean, the guy moved back to New Zealand. He thinks he's going to get this CTO job, and then it's pulled.
Look, I think that no one is disputing that this is a very unfortunate situation. A minister has resigned and by her own admission said that things hadn't been handled as well as they could be. That Mr Handley, of course, was moving back to New Zealand, and he makes that really clear in his text communications and what he's released. But of course, no one is quibbling over the fact that this is an unfortunate set of events.
Are we going to get a CTO, Chief Technology Officer?
So what I took to Cabinet and what Cabinet Committee and Cabinet Committee agreed to is that we need to do some rescoping of that role. I need to report back by the end of November about how that fits together with other parts of the innovation system and make sure that we're maximising the value of this and we're fitting up well with work that Callaghan's doing, what the Government Chief Digital Officer is doing.
Why did you withdraw the role?
Because I wanted to take the opportunity when the Prime Minister asked me to take the role in concert with the innovation portfolio.
But why was he unoffered the role?
What I said is I want to take the opportunity to rescope it and to make sure that it fits.
That doesn't mean anything. Why was he not given the role? Why was it unoffered to him?
He was informed that the role was being rescoped, and that's what I said a couple of weeks ago when I announced that we needed to do that work.
Thanks for your time, Minister. Do appreciate it. Megan Woods there talking about oil, talking about gas, and talking about the Chief Technology Officer role, which was offered to Derek Handley and then unoffered. He got paid out $100,000. He's released his emails and text messages with various